director for Christi here at GSU. And before I introduce our speaker, I just want to kind of lay the foundation for what we're doing tonight, because this is definitely not normal as far as what we do on a week-by-week basis. We do have guest speakers, but this is the first time, I think, that we've had a non-Christian guest speaker, I think. So the topic of tonight is Ask a Muslim, and this was actually requested by the students. They wanted to ask Muslims questions. And so what's going to happen tonight is Mr. Lewis, who is a Muslim, he's going to come up here and he's going to try to essentially share with you why he is a Muslim, and he's going to try to present that persuasively to you. After that's over, you're going to have the chance to ask him questions. Now, I have to emphasize question. This is not a time for you to preach, make statements, give a lecture. If it doesn't end with a little squiggly mark at the end of it, it's not a question. So you can challenge him, ask him as hard of questions as you want to. You can be honest with him. Make sure you're asking him questions. And we can do this all the way until about 9 o'clock. We want to kind of stop at that point. So let me go ahead and introduce our speaker. Shadid Lewis is the regional director of the Muslim Debate Initiative USA. He has received a certification in comparative religion from the Islamic Research and Propagation Center of Queens, New York. Mr. Lewis also studied sciences of the Quran and Islamic family law at Islamic American Open University in Fairfax, Virginia. He is the former president of the Hampton, Virginia Mosque and Islamic Center. Mr. Lewis is currently the host of Mr. Islam Answers Back blog talk radio show and Mr. Islam Answers Back YouTube channel. And you can also find articles and additional information from Shadid Lewis at the Muslim Debate Initiative website at thedebateinitiative.com. And Mr. Lewis didn't include this in his bio, but I will say he has debated many of the best from Christian apologists. So he's heard a lot of the arguments, he's very familiar with them, so don't be afraid to ask him challenging questions because he's probably heard a lot of them before, so don't be shy. So without further ado, let's welcome Shadid Lewis. Just speak.
All right, thank you all for having me. Thank the Christi organization for having me out tonight. All right, in the name of Allah, most beneficent, most merciful. So the topic is Ask a Muslim, but essentially I'll just give some reasons why I'm a Muslim. All right. Well, first of all, for me, I'm originally from New York City, and growing up in New York, you know, I mean, I don't know if you guys, if anybody has been there, or maybe you've heard the rumors about it. I mean, it wasn't like it was horrible or anything like that, but, you know, just growing up in New York, you get to see a lot of things. And so, of course, most people in the United States, we have a Christian background, whether it's, you know, deeply religious or just somewhat religious. Most of us have a Christian background. And I did come from a Christian background. You know, my family, we did go to church and things of that nature. It was around my late teens that I started to, you know, observe my environment, look at my life, look at the life of those around me, and this is where I started to have a change. You know, I began to look, particularly in the African American and Latino community, at a lot of the problems that were had at that time. Many of those problems are unfortunately still here, you know, at least in the United States. And so, like most people, you start to look and search, and you want to find a way. And I never gave up my belief in God or Jesus or anything like that. It was just I had just stopped going to church, and I was just looking for a way, looking for some guidance. And it was about that time that I came across the, it wasn't the autobiography of Malcolm X, but it was a smaller book about Malcolm X. And very interesting how, you know, if anyone's seen the movie or if you know about Malcolm X's story, how he led a life, his early life was a life of crime and drugs and things of that nature until he finally went to prison. And he came in contact, although they wouldn't be considered mainstream Muslims, it was the Nation of Islam where they still have the tenets, some of the tenets of Islam, such as the moral code, staying away from alcohol and fornication and adultery and being an upright, upstanding person. So even though they're not considered mainstream Muslims, they were still using it. They read the Quran and things like that. Just using some of those principles of Islam, he was able to transform his life. And I found that very interesting. So, because he had come from such a hard life to now being the person that he was. And so that began to interest me. And then growing up in New York City has a sizable Muslim population, even back in those days. Like I grew up in the 70s and 80s. So even at that time, New York had a sizable Muslim population. So I began to look at the Muslims in the neighborhood as well. And what stood out about them was that they appeared to be God-fearing people, and they were able to affect the change. They didn't just preach. They didn't just preach, about God and preach about religion and preach about righteousness. They actually practiced it, and they were able to affect the change in the community. For example, where I grew up in New York, in the 80s, there was the crack cocaine epidemic in the inner cities. So you had a lot of drug dealers, you had a lot of shootouts and things like that. And the Muslims in New York actually took a stand about it. Now, other religious groups would, preach and speak against it, but that was as far as it went. When the Muslims came to it, the Muslims spoke against it, but they also took action to actually clean up the neighborhood. They started security patrols, and they went about the community and talking to. They weren't afraid to actually talk to those who were selling and dealing and things of that nature, to affect the change, to either have them change their ways or move them from the neighborhood and make it safe. And they didn't just make the neighborhood safe for everyone. They made the neighborhood safe they didn't make the neighborhood safe for just them, just Muslims. They made the neighborhood safe for everyone. Everyone was able to benefit from what the Muslims had done. So this interested me. I said, wow, these people, looking from my perspective, I said, wow, they must really be God-fearing people. They're not afraid, most people had a fear of the drug dealers, of the gangs and things of that nature, but these men didn't seem to have that fear. They were able to, walk up to them, confront them, speak to them with courage, and there didn't seem to be any fear. And of course, the drug dealers recognized this and made the change. So I said, wow, again, looking from my perspective, these must be God-fearing people. They really fear no one except God in order to make that change. So I started to look into Islam, and at first I thought it was a different God because of in Islam we use the term Allah for God. So I thought, well, if I become a Muslim, am I going to be worshiping a different God? And coming from that Christian background, when I began to read the Quran, I began to see names that, if you come from a Judeo-Christian background, you'd be familiar with. Moses is mentioned, Jesus is there, Abraham, Noah, Isaac, Jacob, etc. Those who you'd be familiar with if you came from that Judeo-Christian background. The only difference is that in the Arabic language we use the term or the name Allah in reference to the one God. So when I read that, I said, okay, well, obviously although they use a different name, they're not worshiping a different God per se. Sure, of course, between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, there's some differences about what we believe about God. However, the overall bigger picture is that nonetheless, regardless of the differences, it's still a reference to that same God. In Islam, you read the Quran, it talks about God created Adam and Eve. So although you may disagree with we may have some differences in creed and beliefs, there's no denying that it's still referring to that same God. For example, if you were to perhaps read the Hindu scriptures or Buddhist scriptures or something of that nature, obviously it's not going to take you back to the Judeo-Christian background. You're not going to read about the creation of Adam and Eve or Jesus or Moses, etc. So you would know that this is something different. But when I began to read the Quran, I began to see that it says, okay, although there's a different name, some differences in creed and belief, it's still overall referring to that same one God that created Adam and Eve and sent Jesus and Moses and etc. Of course, in Islam, there's an additional prophet, and that is what we consider the last prophet, which is Muhammad. So beyond the superficial, which was, as I said, it was something tangible, something that I could see the results were there. So I was impressed by that, and and I said, wow, this is what we need. This is in this community, this is what we need, because obviously whatever other practices were going on, we're not making that effective change in the community. People were doing things and preaching, but things were still remaining the same. You see, whereas in the Islam, the preaching was done, but the results were also present that you could see. So, as I said, beyond that, beyond the superficial things that you could see, I began then to look into the actual beliefs of Islam. And so, Islam has the belief in one God. I said, okay, I can go along with that. We're not taught to believe in multiple gods or, idols and statues and things of that nature. So I said, okay, I can, coming from, again, that Christian background, this is something that I can relate to. I can go along with this. The other thing that Islam has, which was the result of what I was seeing, was that it has a moral code of conduct. And of course, that is the Muslim holy book, which is the Quran. The Quran is the book that the Muslims refer to for religious guidance, religious instructions, spirituality, knowing God's will, things of that nature. And it's so much so that moral conduct is so well known that even nowadays, we used to have a little joke in New York where you would have non-Muslims who are aware of the Muslim conduct. That if a Muslim was, in fact, doing something that they shouldn't be doing, for example, Muslims are known not to eat pork or to drink alcohol and things of that nature. So if there was a person who was known to be Muslim and perhaps they were straying, and maybe a non-Muslim saw them partaking of alcohol or eating a pork sandwich or something like that, non-Muslims would actually correct them, like, hey, you're not supposed to be doing that. That's how well known the moral code is known amongst, in Islam, that even non-Muslims are aware of it, and they would even point out that, hey, you're not supposed to be doing that, you shouldn't be drinking, or you shouldn't be eating that, things of that nature, because the moral code is there. The other thing about Islam is that it has that balance. It has that balance of the spirituality and the practical living. So it's not about, it's not about the letter of the law all the time, where everybody has to be, you got to follow the law to the letter, and it's all about that. We also bring the two together with a balance of the spirituality. There's that spirituality. Islam has our prayers, where the minimum of 5 daily prayers, where you take time out of your day to actually, get in contact with God. You shouldn't just, go throughout your day with no remembrance of God. You actually take time out of your day, 5 times a day throughout the day, to actually communicate with God, to praise God, and just let, put everything aside, put your work aside, and whatever else is going on in your life, and give that time, a few moments, to actually praise God, to talk to God, speak to God, pray, however you feel. So I like that balance that it had as well, that it wasn't just about, the rules all the time, but it had that balance of both. Muslims are allowed to have fun and play and, enjoy time with your family or your spouse or whatever. It's not all about being strict and stringent all the time. So these were the things that I looked at. The other thing also that particularly for me, coming from my background, that I liked about Islam also, was that in Islam, there is the, what I would phrase it as the standing against oppression or the repelling of evil. Where in Islam, which is why, especially in the United States, a lot of African Americans are attracted to Islam, because it has, you should know already the history that we have in the United States. Everybody's watching the news now, and unfortunately, we still have this problem with the racism and the discrimination and going on. And so, it attracts a lot of African Americans in particular, because that Islam stresses that particular point of view, that it actually has teachings that talk about taking a stand or speaking out against, oppression, wrongdoing, mistreatment of others, and things of that nature. So when of course Islam was here before my time, you see that Malcolm X and those who began to come to Islam, that was one of the attracting things about it, is that it offered a way to deal with oppression. In Christianity, not putting anything down, but in Christianity, it has the concept of turning the other cheek and loving your enemy and things of that nature. Whereas in Islam, it's not about revenge or whatever, but it's about not allowing people to walk over you, not allowing others to mistreat you. Because there's a verse in the Quran that says that had it not been that Allah or God would use other men to check other men, the evildoers would have the run of the place. You know, for example, you can take an example. If we didn't have police officers, then those who are the criminals would have the run of the place. But of course, society realized that we have to have someone to enforce the law to keep, you know, those of us who are law-abiding citizens safe from those who are willing to, you know, flout the laws and do as they please. So Islam addresses these issues. And so that was also another thing that attracted me to Islam, that it has this stance of taking a stand against oppression, taking a stand against wrongdoing and mistreatment of others, or against yourself as well. And beyond that, also Islam offers, you know, although we hear a lot of things in the media that, you know, it's a very mean religion, or Islam has a mean God. This is all wrong. In Islam, it has the concept of mercy. It has the concept of forgiveness. A lot of times when speaking to Christians, that's one of the issues that a lot of people speak about. But in Islam, when you read the Quran, the teachings of Islam does speak that God, Allah, is merciful. He is forgiving. That, you know, you're not doomed. You know, there is the way to repentance. God is willing to let you turn back to Him, and He's you know, have open arms to accept those who have gone wrong if they turn around and come back to Him. And so these are the reasons that attracted me to Islam, and these are the reasons today why I'm still a Muslim to this very day. So I guess from there, I guess we can open up questions and answers. So.
Just want to start out saying Assalamu alaikum and thank you for coming and speaking with us today. I was wondering if you could explain the concept of makruh and how it relates with halal and haram according to the Quran.
Yeah, the things that are disliked. Well, I mean, the Quran, as it mentions, that it has those things that are clear and direct. And so this is how the Muslim would, like I mentioned about the pork and all those different things like that. So all these things are outlined, that, you know, you shouldn't partake of the swine, intoxicants. Really, intoxicants, most people translate alcohol, but it really means any intoxicants. Anything that intoxicates your mind, whether it's alcohol, something you smoke, sniff, or whatever, is all prohibited. And so these are the things that would be, actually, this is the thing what we call haram, you know, that are prohibited. Things outside of that, where it's in a gray area, you know, you look at, and that's another thing that I appreciate about Islam too, that it allows you to, I guess if you will, analyze the situation and see, you know, what is the benefit of this thing or the harm of it, and then that would determine whether the thing is disliked or if it's permissible, you know, in that gray area. But other things other than that are clearly outlined, and so that's how the Muslim would deal with the things that are disliked, based upon, if it's not something that's directly stated, you know, in Islamic teachings, based upon the harm or benefit that the issue or the item would bring to the person or to society at large.
Yes, when you debate other Christians and they claim that Jesus Christ is God and is not just a prophet, your belief is that's wrong, correct? How do you, I'm not sure how to debate what the question would be, but how do you normally answer to when a Christian says that Jesus Christ is God? How do you say, no, he isn't, based off what evidence do you use? Scriptural evidence or?
Right, yeah. It's a combination of things, like, of course, you know, the Muslims' source is the Quran. But when I'm debating, I understand that obviously my opponent or the audience, if Christian, obviously won't probably accept what the Quran says. But I still mention it anyway, just to show the Muslim perspective. From there, I would give some biblical verses and then, you know, make a reasonable argument along with that. For example, I like to usually use John 8:40, where it is said that Jesus says, speaking to the Pharisees, scribes and Pharisees, now you seek to kill me, a man that has told you the truth that I heard from God. This did not Abraham. And so I focus on the part where he says clearly that he's telling them he's a man, and then he says that he heard the truth from God. So then I go with the reasonable answer. I say, well, look, if he's supposed to be God himself, how is it that he's saying that he heard the truth from God if there's only one God and he's supposed, according to what Christians tell us, that he's the very God himself? Why is he saying that I heard the truth from God? Now, of course, Christians have the response and they say that that's when he was on earth or whatever, but I'm like, he's still, even if he's on earth, you're still telling me that he's God. And so that's one of the arguments that I would use. So I use a combination of Quranic verses, some verses from the Bible, and then I'll try to make like I just did, a reasonable argument to go along with that to try to get my point across.
Sweet.
As far as that goes, aren't there also verses in the Bible where Jesus does claim that he is God, or he is the Son of God, and he is the Son of God, not others as well?
Well, I mean, now, Son of God is one thing, but claiming that he is God, we always have this thing with Christians when we're debating to say, yes, where is that where he says that he's God? Now, Son of God is different. For example, if the person, like, for example, you have Obama's daughters, right? If one of them comes to you and says, I'm the daughter of the president, you say, okay, that's fine. You're not the president, though. You're the daughter of the president. So if he says that he's son of God, then that's, son of God doesn't mean that you are God yourself. So that's how we look at it. Yes.
How does the concept of redemption work in Islam without the divinity of Jesus?
In Islam, it's basically, I guess I would put it as a personal relationship with God, or a one-on-one relationship with God, where God deals with you himself. So in Islam, there are verses that speak about a person who is, basically who feels that they've lost their soul to themselves. But the verse says that, but God is merciful. If you turn from your ways and you turn back to God, he's always merciful and he's always willing to, accept your return. So basically, it's like that one-on-one, without a middleman, without a mediator. It's just God himself dealing with you. In the Quran it says he's the most merciful, the most kind, and so this is how he deals with without having a middleman, mediator in the middle. Yeah.
How do you, how do you get that personal relationship with God?
Well, there are a number of teachings in Islam that, as I mentioned, we have to do the prayers, and it's mandatory. In other words, of course, there are extra prayers that a Muslim can do as extra prayers whenever they feel like it, but the 5 mandatory prayers, they're mandatory upon the Muslim to take the time out of their day to make those prayers. And in the Quran, it talks about how you build your close relationship with God through the prayers. That's why I said you take time out of your day. You have a busy day, your work, the stress, family, whatever, but you got to take the time out of your day. God, according to the Islamic teaching, wants you to put aside those things for just a moment and give some time to him. And in that giving time, it builds your relationship with God. It builds your closeness to God. There are verses in the Quran that talk about the night prayer. This would be considered an extra prayer. But getting up in the middle of the night when everyone else is sleeping, you forsake your bed to get up and, again, talk to God, pray to God. And these are the things that the Quran says builds your closer relationship with God. So that's how it would be done. Oh, I'm sorry. You said.
Yeah, I have a friend who's Muslim, and he talks about that faith and the Quran being simultaneously taken as true of Allah, and that they were teachings of Muhammad to be followed in the same way. And I was just wondering what's the difference between the Quran and the Hadith, and if a Muslim doesn't go to the Hadith, do they now become a non-Muslim?
Okay. Yeah, I wouldn't say that they're the same, because the Quran is obviously the highest source of Islam. So I wouldn't say that they're on even level. It's clear that the Quran speaks of itself as the book of the best, that it gives the best guidance. There's no other book like it. So the Quran definitely stands alone. It's not like you even think the Quran definitely stands alone. The Hadiths are supposed to be, for those who are not familiar, they are considered sayings of Muhammad, or things that either some of his contemporaries at his time, either they heard him say, or saw him perform an action, or something where another believer, another follower at the time may have done a particular action, and either he disapproved of what they did, or he accepted what they did. And they were, they're not like the Quran. The Quran is considered the word of Allah, the word of God, like the actually revealed word of God. Whereas the Hadith, as I said, were things that, they're basically writings that others said they heard, saw, or he saw somebody else do something and he approved or disapproved. And then these things were collected over a period of time and compiled into different books. So they're different from the Quran in that sense. You might find some Muslims who think that they're even, but again, the evidence is clear that they're not. The Quran is definitely the highest source that the Muslims refer to. As far as your question about whether if a Muslim doesn't follow the Hadith, whether that makes them become a Muslim, that's a question that scholars that scholars deal with. Some say that the person would not become a Muslim because they're putting it basically. they're putting it that the hadiths are supposed to be teachings of Muhammad, and he's the prophet of God. So therefore, if these are believed to be what he actually said, and you disobey them, then obviously you're disobeying what he gave from God. Then there's another view that because of the that level, that, there's a degree of uncertainty. There's a degree of uncertainty about them. There is a position that that's not necessarily the case, because we have to see what's the person's reasoning for not following them. Is it because of the And from what I've seen, most of the people who say that they don't follow them is because of that level of uncertainty. They say, look, there's this level of uncertainty. I can't be certain that Muhammad said this, so therefore I'm backing out. So me, from my own perspective, I would say that person, that doesn't sound like a person. He's not rejecting Islam. He's not saying that Muhammad's not the prophet. He's not rejecting Islam. He's just saying, look, I'm not certain that these writings are what he actually said. And I said that degree of uncertainty is that no one can really say that he 100% said it, because they were collected over a period of time. And they even had to develop what they call science of hadith, where it was a science that was, it was a man-made concept, but how they could try to best discern what was truthful from what was false. And of course, it's not a foolproof system. You see what I'm saying? So if the person, if that's their perspective on why they're not following it, then from my own position, I would say I couldn't say that they're not Muslim, but you might find some Islamic scholars that would say that the person's not, because from their perspective, they're saying, hey, look, Muhammad said that you got to listen. But from the other side, I'm saying, well, I can understand what they're saying. They're saying that, they're not 100% certain that he said it, so therefore that's why they're holding back from it. But they're not rejecting that he's the prophet. They're not rejecting that, Allah is Allah, etc. So.
Sorry, it's the same question I had a minute ago. As far as the daily prayers, a lot of the time when I'm in the BCM and we do lunch prayer and we do dinner prayer, what I hear is asking God for favors, asking God for strength and things, and I don't feel like that would be the concept of those daily prayers. So what kind of, I would assume it's more conversational, but what kind of prayers would be typical as you go throughout your day?
That's a good point, because that was another thing too, that I remember as a Christian, that a lot of times when prayer was done, it was mostly to ask for something. God, I need help with this, or whatever, things of that nature like that. Where in the Islamic prayer, it's mostly actually just praising God. I mean, you can, if there is a need in your life, we have a separate prayer for that, which is called, it's like a supplication, where it's just a personal prayer for need or want or something in your life. You need help with your bills, or you got stress and you just want to get the stress away, or help with this bill, something like that. But when we do the actual formal prayers, it's actually just concentrated on giving God praise. Nothing personal for yourself, just giving God the praise and the glory, and it really deals with that. So that's how it's done. Did you?
Oh, yeah. You talked about how Islam, is that how you say it?
Islam.
Okay. Islam teaches that oppression is wrong and everything. But isn't it also true that there are some women in Islam countries that are oppressed?
We always hear about that. We see that in the media, in some of the Middle Eastern countries, the Arab countries, about oppression of women. And I don't know. I mean, it really depends on what we're looking at, because if it's coming from what, as the Western society, we think about how women carry themselves here as opposed to how they carry themselves here. Over there, it's different, because I have articles that are addressing that, where they actually interview women in Saudi Arabia and things of that nature. And from their perspective, they in the article they say that they're not oppressed. They're saying they choose to cover themselves like this. They say they choose, or they like the fact that their husbands are taking care of the business and whatever the case may be. So from their perspective, they're saying that they're not oppressed. They're not feeling oppressed. But as I said, from a Western perspective, where you can dress how you want, or it may look like it's oppression. Now that's not to say that in some places there may be some harsh treatment or mistreatment of women. But again, as many Muslims will tell you, that unfortunately a lot of that is cultural. A lot of that is cultural. There's really no Islamic basis for that mistreatment. You know what I mean? So in that sense, yeah, if you're talking about the kind of stuff that we see where somebody's being mistreated or things of that nature, then that comes from the cultural, as opposed, for example, Saudi Arabia doesn't allow women to drive cars. that's more of a cultural thing. Other Muslim countries allow women to drive cars. Egypt, women can drive. Turkey, they can drive. And, you know, that's something that the Saudis themselves have for their own, for whatever cultural reasons, that they don't allow, they don't want women to drive. You know, so that kind of, you know, if it's looked upon as oppression, that's something that they've done regardless of what Islam says.
This Muslim friend of mine always talks about these different sects of Muslim. You have, or Islam, you have Sunni, Shiites, and Wasabis, Wahhabis, yeah. And so I was wondering, why are there different sects, and do they believe that one sect is the only true religion or way to follow Islam? And does it pertain to a teaching in the Quran? My friend always brings up that there's going to be a sect that is going to be saved, and the rest be damned to them.
Well, the thing about this, well, let's start from the beginning. Well, first of all, the reasons for the sect. I don't know, it's something, I guess we see in all religions where there's always the foundation, and then somewhere down the line in history, because people, you know, maybe there's a particular interpretation of a particular scripture or verse or word or something like that, and someone hangs on to it, and then from there they start developing ideas, they get followers, and then you get a sect from there. And so I think that happens with, you know, with all religions, you know. As far as what the Quran says, interesting though, the Quran actually says, don't break up into groups, don't break up into sects, you see. The thing that you mentioned about the group, the supposed saved group, that comes from a hadith. You see, that comes from a hadith actually. So, you know, from my experience, I haven't seen, other than like the Wahhabis, but most other groups I haven't really, at least myself, haven't heard them, like I haven't heard Sufis or Shiite say that, you know, they're the group and they're the saved group and they're the correct way. I really haven't heard it, you know what I mean? But the thing from again, this is my own personal studies, that I feel that if the Quran says that don't break up into sects, then really any group that makes themselves a sect is wrong. Those who remain as what the Quran says, just being Muslims, you're actually the group would be the right group. So anybody, once you say, well, we're this group, and you're admitting that you're a group, you've already violated what the Quran says. You already made yourself a sect. The Quran says don't do it. So the Muslims who stay away from the other groups and just keep practicing what Islam teaches, you know, I would consider that the group that's going to be saved. So, you know, because once you make yourself, these groups have names. They give themselves certain names. So once that's being done, this is to me a sign that they're blatantly violating what the Quran says because they're making a sect. Now, of course, a lot of these groups have excuses why they're doing it. Well, we have to call ourselves this because everybody, like the argument I've heard is that, you know, we have to call ourselves this because everybody says they're Muslim. How are you going to be able to distinguish this Muslim from that Muslim? So that's it. So we got to call ourselves this, or we got to call ourselves that. But to me, I don't buy that argument because of the very fact, once again, that in the Quran it says that that's the name to call ourselves Muslims. He didn't say you call yourself this kind of Muslim. It just said you're Muslims, and he says don't break up into sects. So from my perspective, any group that breaks off into a group and labels themselves is not going to be the same group because they're violating what the Quran already said not to do.
Do you believe that everything the Quran says is necessarily true? And if so, how do you defend that belief?
I mean, yeah, as a believer, you know, I guess you'd have to give me something specific. But yeah, as a believer, I believe, you know, what it says. I try to follow it as best I can. But if you had a particular like example of something, you know.
I was just wondering if you think if the Quran said something, it has to be true because there's a reason that everything in the Quran is true. Like some Christians claim that if the Bible says something, it has to be true.
So, you know, in other words, you're saying like what I accepted, like based upon a circular argument, that it's true because the Quran says it's true, something like that.
Well, Christians like to give a defense for why the Bible, as these particular books, are the entire Word of God. So they have some reasoning besides just a circular.
Okay, right, yeah, well, yeah, as a Muslim, right. Yeah, we would also, and that's, again, this is another thing that I appreciate about Islam too, is that the Quran doesn't want you to just blindly follow. It actually says, you know, when you say something, produce your evidence for it. Produce your book to actually ponder, you know, and examine, you know, the creation and things like that. So it actually doesn't want you to just, in other words, it's not saying believe it because I said so. It says go ahead and look at the evidence. Go ahead and examine this or that instead of just blindly accepting it. So from the Muslim perspective, yeah, we would believe in it because we can see some evidence for it to support it, as opposed to just, well, I believe it just because it says what it says and it's from God. And no, we actually are encouraged to look for the evidence behind those things.
If you're not Muslim, will you go to hellfire?
This is a question as well that most people would say that from the Quranic perspective, that just like Christianity, that if obviously if you haven't, but basically, well, I guess there's 2 ways to look at it. One is a person who hasn't heard about Islam. Obviously they would be a non-Muslim, they haven't heard about Islam, so they haven't necessarily purposely rejected it, then this person falls under a different category. But if there's a person who, the invitation has been made to Islam, and it's a willful rejection of Islam, then that non-Muslim person would be considered to, have the doom of the hellfire. But a non-Muslim who has not heard about Islam or has never really been invited to Islam, they would be considered an automatic, candidate for hell.
How do you, I think still on topic, how do you treat when the atheist argues with you and basically goes to the very ground of your argument and says that there is no God? Mm-hmm. What, besides the Quran, do you use to say, actually, no, there is a God? Do you use philosophy? What do you use to?
Yeah, I guess I would try to, use some philosophy, usually if I do, because sometimes we do discuss with atheists as well. And I'll try to use an argument. It may be based upon the Quran, but I won't start quoting scriptures to them. But because I already know what some of the things that the Quran mentions, like I mentioned about looking at the creation, so I'll use an argument like that. I say, let's look at our universe. Look how we have the planets. They're all in order. There's an order to them. We can calculate. It's such an order to it that we can calculate each planet, how long it takes for each planet to go around the sun, the moons that go around, because it's not chaotic. There's an order to it. And usually as humans, whenever we see something with an order to it, we know that there was a designer to it. Like if I just took, if I had a bunch of balls, let's say I had a bunch of balls, and they were representative of our planets, and I just threw them up in the air, and they landed. They're not necessarily going to land in the order that the planets are. So I said, look at our planets. They're all in order. They stay in order. They stay in their orbit. To me, I look at them and say, look, there obviously was a supreme designer to this because it has such an order to it, so much so that we can recognize and we can calculate, the revolutions and how long it takes for each planet to go around, and the moons and the suns, space. There's an order to it. Even here, as us, there's an order to us. We breathe out carbon dioxide, which benefits the trees and plant life. The plant life gives back oxygen to us, and that system, I said to me, that's intelligence. Something. It didn't seem like something haphazard could just throw that together. Because when we look at things that are chaotic in our world, there's no order to it. You're walking through the woods and you see a pile of sticks, it's a pile of sticks. But if you see that the sticks are kind of put together in a certain way, it's like, some animal, maybe a beaver or whatever animal, something, some animal with some type, even though it might be a low level of intelligence, you can tell that those sticks were stacked in some kind of organized fashion. So I use that type of argument, with the atheists to try to make my point. Yes. You were next? Was it?
Yeah.
No, sorry.
Earlier you mentioned how oftentimes the oppression of women in countries that happen to be Islamic is often mischaracterized or misinterpreted. But isn't there, doesn't the Quran actually allow for divorce, and arguably so that that's a form of liberation for women.
That it allows for divorce?
Yes.
Yeah, in Islam, divorce is permissible. Divorce is allowed. Yeah. So it does, it does allow for if a couple, they just can't get along. You're not bound to stay in that union. It does allow for either side to seek separation, seek divorce, if you're unhappy.
So women can seek divorce?
Yes. I think he was listening.
I was wondering what your view is of ISIS, and if they do follow the moral code of standing against oppression. And are they following the Quran or the Hadith?
All right, with ISIS, I can only go on what I've heard, you know, because I watch the same media here in the West that we all watch. From what I see in the media, if what we're being told is true, that what they're doing, then this is of course against Islam. You know, we're seeing or we're hearing that they're harming other Muslims. In fact, it seems like they're the biggest threat that they are is actually to other Muslims. You know, mistreatment of other Muslims, and again, the reason why I say if what they're saying is true, because again, you know, I'm only going by what I hear in the media. So based on what I see from the media, if these things are true, that what they're doing, then yeah, this is wrong. This is not from Islam. I would even say it's not even from Hadith, because you know the Hadith doesn't even allow some of the things that we're doing. So it's not from either source. You know what I mean?
But don't they post their own videos online as well?
Well, that's what we're told. You know, yeah, we're told that but and see, that's the thing that I always wondered too. These are the things that I question, because I'm like, you know, just like even before that with Al Qaeda and things like that, I'm like, you know, these guys are supposed to be on the run. They're out in the desert. You know, where are you getting an internet connection from? Where are you getting electricity from? How is it that these guys have cameras and these, and if they do have these things give off signals. You tell them, how come we can't find them? How come they can't be pinpointed when they're using all these electronic equipment? So, you know, I just kind of question some of those things. But again, if the things that they're doing is correct, is true, then yeah, then these things, they don't come from the Quran or the Hadith. You know, Hadiths and Quranic verses can be shown to condemn what they're doing, and show that what they're doing is not part of Islam.
He can actually ask the question that I was going to ask you, so that answered it. Okay.
I found it interesting that you said that Islam appealed to you as an African American because of this country's history with slavery.
Mm-hmm.
How do you justify Muhammad having slaves and telling his men to have slaves and conquering the world and enslaving people, and then it's still being practiced today?
Right. Well, from what my studies of Islam shows that he actually freed the slaves. That many of when he was doing his preaching, the Arabs already, you know, they were already practicing slavery before Islam. But as he began to preach, and there's verses in the Quran that actually speak of freeing a slave for various reasons. So from what I saw, that if he did buy somebody who was a slave, he bought that person to set them free, not to continue to perpetuate slavery. And again, there are many verses in the Quran that speak of freeing slaves for various reasons. Some reasons, you know, if you made a violation, you can free a slave as an expiation for a sin or wrongdoing. And then there are verses that say to free a slave just for the goodness of it, just for the goodness of freeing a person, you can free a person. So this is, this is what I've seen. As far as enslaving others, again, my studies have shown that these things come from. Matter of fact, I'll quote somebody, Sir Thomas W. Arnold, who was not a Muslim, but he wrote in, you know, maybe in the early, I'm not sure if the early 1800s, early 1900s, about Islam. And he said those stories or, you know, things mentioned like that, he said came from, you know, either, Westerners or Christian evangelists who were trying to, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but basically just trying to tarnish the image of Islam. But his studies found that, you know, these things were pretty essentially untrue. You know, that Muhammad didn't go around enslaving people and conquering at the point of the sword and things of that nature. And again, you know, there are Quranic verses that clearly show that, you know, the matter of fact, there's verses in the Quran that over a dozen of them that actually say that, you know, your job is only to deliver the message, that, you know, convey the message to them, but if they turn away, if they reject Islam, your job is only to deliver the message. You have not been made a guardian over them. So that refutes, you know, that any idea. And of course, if Muhammad is truly the prophet, it's unlikely that he would have disobeyed that command and said, well, you know, I'm going to force people when there's clearly Quranic verses. And again, there's over a dozen of them that actually say that same phrase. Your job is only to deliver the message. You have not been made a guardian over these people. In other words, if they reject, you have no right to rule and force them to accept, because your job is just to deliver the message. See? What's anybody here?
To what extent does the Quran address political structure and suppose theocracy and Sharia law, like how those three interplay within the text? Within the text
of the Quran? Well, really, I don't know, the Quran, it doesn't really like speak or give any like direct directions or commands on how to set up a theocracy or a government. Most of that comes from extra Quranic material. The Quran, it just speaks of mankind as God's viceroy upon the earth, but doesn't really speak in any direct manner of I want you to go and set up. You have to set up the territory, and you have to choose this person, and here's how it's done. And that's really not in the Quran. It just gives as I mentioned, rules and guidelines on how we as human beings should interact with each other as Muslims and things of that nature, but nothing direct that mentions that you have to elect this person and this is how you set it up and things of that nature. Most of that is like extra Quranic.
The Hadith addresses that, right? Sharia law.
I mean, even really in the Hadith, like I said, it would be the Sharia law comes from like a combination of like some things maybe taken from Hadith, but then there's also like scholarly opinions and things like that where it was combined together, and then that's how it's formed. But as I said, from the Quranic perspective, it doesn't really say directly that you should set up the kingdom and this and that and things like that.
So is Sharia? You said that's from supplemental.
Yeah, Sharia is derived from it's derived from certain verses from the Quran, and it's derived from certain things from Hadith. It's also derived from scholarly opinions about certain things, and then all that together was used to, falls under what is called the Sharia.
There's a story I hear in the Quran all the time, and I gotta be truthful, I haven't actually looked in the Quran, so maybe you can clear it up for me. Something like Muhammad. What's the word? Muhammad said that it was okay that his followers could rape women or something, and and I have like a hard time believing that any spiritual book.
Right, yeah.
Like
I mean, think about it. I mean, look at me. I mean, I consider myself a person, a reasonable person, a level-headed person. I mean, I guarantee you right now, I would not be a Muslim right now if such a teaching. And I don't think anybody in their right mind would follow a religion that has something blatant as that to say it's okay to rape. No, there's nothing in Islam. In fact, there is punishment against rapists and things of that nature. So there's nothing in Islam that says it's okay for my followers to go ahead and rape and violate a woman like that. No, I wouldn't be standing up here talking about Islam if such a teaching. And like I said, I don't think the millions of Muslims around the world, if they had in their right mind, would continue to follow such a religion or even a man that taught such a thing. I think I saw you raise your hand first in the back.
What do you think? What do you think is the answer to the proliferation of Wahhabi Islam around the world? Like, how do Muslims think? What do Muslims think the answer is to that?
What I think
the solution to Wahhabi extremism.
I don't know. I mean, it's basically Muslims having to, as I mentioned, bring it back in and start going back to the main source. You know what I mean? Stop, leave off these opinions and start checking those opinions against the main source, which is the Quran, and see, are these things agreeing with what the Quran is teaching? Are these people, making extra Quranic ideas that are not necessarily supported by the Quran? And I think that's what needs to happen to deal with that type of extremism, because
like, are there like international forums where Muslims like
they're starting to come up? There things like that are starting to come up where people are becoming aware of the issue, and there's groups of people, maybe small groups, but people are starting to talk about it. And I think that's the start, where people need to start talking about it, address it, and say, look, we gotta bring it back in, and these extra Quranic things, they need to start being checked against what the Quran is saying, and we need to return back to it. So I see it happening. I see people starting to, come up and address these issues. Let's see now. Everybody, a lot of guys hands together at the same time. So I started.
Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, for real.
I was just wondering. The Bible says multiple times that God is the God of Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac, and you have in the Quran the very myself at Ishmael, and I get the Bible going beyond Isaac and Jacob. Doesn't that present a different distinction between the God of the Bible and the God of the Quran?
No, because there are verses in the Quran that also mention that he's the God of Abraham. Abraham has a very high position in the Quran. There's many verses and chapters that speak about Abraham. So I mean, only what it does is it includes Ishmael in. Even in the Bible, I mean, Ishmael's in the Bible as well. Yeah. But the Quran, it doesn't just say the God of Ishmael. It mentions that, he sent Abraham, he sent Moses, Jesus, Noah, etc., Ishmael, Jacob, Isaac. They're all mentioned. They're all mentioned in the Quran. So no, it doesn't present. That's why I mentioned earlier that when I began to read that, for me, coming from a Christian background, I said, okay, so if I did accept Islam, it wouldn't like I would be turning to worship a different God. Although, as I said, there's disagreements in beliefs about God. But overall, I'm still seeing that the Quran is telling me to believe in the God that sent Abraham, that sent Moses, that created Adam and Eve. So you understand what I'm saying? So no, for me, I said it wouldn't be a problem.
I was wondering, because that presents a lineage for Jesus Christ where he was born through the line of Isaac. And is that the same thing for the Quran as well?
It does speak that Abraham, through Abraham's progeny, that they would be blessed with prophethood and things like that. But it's not really so much because there are other prophets mentioned in the Quran that the Bible doesn't have. So, I mean, the lineage is not so much the important key. It's more or less God choosing, righteous men to receive the message and then carry it out to humanity. That's really the most important thing as opposed to the bloodline. Because, like, the Quran gives an example about that, like, for example, with some of Noah's sons. One of Noah's sons, although he was from Noah, a prophet, he was disobedient. So that was the point to show it, was that, don't get so caught up in the bloodline. Because you could be a prophet, but some of your children could wind up being disobedient to God. So it's not, the lineage is not the thing. It's the obedience to God that's the key, So.
At what time was the Quran written?
Well, I don't know if you've heard the latest development. Well, from the Islamic perspective, when the Quran was being revealed, Muhammad would dictate to his followers to write it down on whatever materials that they had available to them. So from the Islamic perspective, it was written down maybe in rough draft form. In other words, it wasn't like written on nice paper, in book form, but whatever materials they had available, they would write it as it was revealed. But I don't know if you've seen, there was a recent discovery. I don't know what's the latest, but the last I saw was that it was only 2 pages though, of a very old Quran that they did the carbon dating, and it seems to date back to right within Muhammad's lifetime. So that's showing that the Quran was actually written down on parchment or paper or whatever materials they had, but in a nice form at his actual time. But then again, that to us, that would be like, well, we already, as Muslims, that was already part of the Islamic history, that it was being written as it was revealed. It wasn't like revealed and then written centuries later. It was within that time period.
There's this notion, I'm sure you're familiar with the term universalism, where it says, in the end, because they use the argument, God is love, and love transcends all bounds. Eventually, everyone will be saved. Have you ever thought, or does the Quran ever point to something like that? That maybe there isn't a certain sect that goes to hell, that there perhaps is a chance that everyone will end up being saved and go to heaven?
I would say sort of, and what I mean by that is in Islam there is a concept where people can be taken out of hell. Like, in other words, some would go to hell for a period of time, but I guess in a sense you could look at it like serving your sentence. After a certain period of time has been served, that some people could be taken out. But of course, it still shows that some would just be doomed to stay, But it does have, so I said sort of, it has that concept sort of, where not everyone has to be doomed to stay in eternity. There is the chance for some people to be brought out after a period of time is served. Oh yes, you have.
What is the stance on gender issues and sexualities that differ from the typical man and woman?
Literally my question.
With homosexuality and things like in Islam, it's disliked, it's frowned upon. The thing in Islam is basically, so I guess it's sort of like the military. The military is don't ask, don't tell type of thing. So in Islam, really in all sin, even when it comes to male and female relationship, if there's sin going on like adultery or fornication, in Islam it's about not exposing your sin. So even if it's a man and woman relationship and you're not married and you're sleeping with each other or something, this it shouldn't be put out into the public eye. So even with those issues like that, of course Islam has the role that a man should be a man and a woman should be a woman and women should dress like women and men should dress like men and things of that nature. But when it comes to that particular Because there are like hadiths that speak about effeminate men being around at the time, and obviously they were around at the time. The thing was just that, you know, it shouldn't be a blatant thing that's put forward into the public. You know what I mean? So if that's going on, it shouldn't be, as they say, coming out the closet. Don't come out the closet. Keep that in private. Again, that doesn't mean it's acceptable now. You know, from the Quranic perspective, just like in the Bible, it's considered a sin. It's considered an abomination. It's considered a sin. But, you know, in Islam, it's not to be put out into the public. It's something you have to deal with on your own, just like any other issue. If you have a problem with alcoholism, deal with it, but it's not something that should be put out to the public and broadcasted that, hey, look, I'm doing this, because it's not accepted in Islam. You know, but you know, it's not an immediate doom. It's not an immediate death sentence because of that. It's something that should be kept private. Yes.
Okay. So the other half of my question was gender issues, and I did kind of want to go into that. As far as trans people, binary or not, what is the Quranic view on transness? I guess.
Like a person becomes transgender, they want to.
No, not even necessarily just with surgery, just not identifying as what you were told at birth, just trans in general.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as that goes, like, what would be the perspective from the Quran?
Again, as long as that feeling is not acted upon. In other words, if you have that, you know, you feel that about yourself. Again, from the Islamic perspective, as God is seeing everything, as long as you may have those feelings, you know, you may like a man who likes another man, a woman likes a woman, as long as those things are not acted upon, because again, if it's acted upon, then it's considered a sin in the eyes of God.
I'm sorry, that was, again, a sexuality. I'm asking about gender, not sexuality, it's separate, I'm sorry.
Okay. So give me a little bit more details. So you're saying that the person...
Someone who is born designated male or born designated female that does not identify with their birth gender may or may not choose to medically become a different gender.
Mm-hmm.
Like, as far as that, what is the Quranic perspective on that particular
There probably is no Quranic.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. But so right,
that's what I'm asking.
Right, all right, well, yeah, I mean, there's nothing direct about it. I mean, it addresses the acting upon the homosexual, you know, activity. But as far as a person, if that's how they feel personally, yeah, there's nothing in particular that speaks about it, you know, in a direct manner. So I would say, basically, like I said, just from a Quranic perspective, as long as if the person is feeling that way, as long as, again, I know you said that's sexuality, but again, if that's the person themselves, then that's just the person themselves. As long as they don't say, well, I feel like I was born a guy, but I think I'm a woman, and so I'm going to start sleeping with other men. It really addresses the actual act of, you know, as opposed to the gender issue.
Okay. No, I wanted to clarify that. Sorry.
No, it's fine.
And I was just wondering, in the Bible, the death of Jesus is a very important aspect of Christianity and the belief in it. And I was reading the Quran where it says that the death of Jesus he didn't actually die, but it seemed to them like he died. And why is there this difference in both religions?
Yeah, on that issue, what the Quran says that basically it's you could look at it as saying that as opposed to God allowing, because you know Jesus is God's prophet, and obviously God favors his prophet, and so that's why the Quran mentions that there were those who plotted a plan to do Jesus harm. And him being a prophet of God and having God on his side, God would not allow his enemies to get the upper hand over his chosen prophet. And so he saves him from them. And to them, you know, when they attempted to take his life, you know, to them it appeared that they had taken his life, but in reality they had not. And the overall theme is that basically saying that God saved him from the plot of his enemies.
So he didn't die on the cross.
So he didn't die on the cross, right?
According to the Quran.
The Quran, of course.
And how does that, I guess, reflect or kind of go with the document that the Roman government had of Pilate making that decision?
Well, that's the thing, that there is no document. From what I've seen, I haven't seen any document as of such that Pilate, and that's one of the arguments that I use when I debate people, is that, you know, I have source after source letting us know that, you know, the Romans, they were pretty good at keeping their records. However, there's no record of this particular incident. Now, a lot of people say, well, there's not a record of a lot of incidents. But I always point out that this is the way the Bible makes it, and when we see, you know, when we hear about it, it made it seem like this was a major disturbance at the time. That has, you know, Jesus, he has his disciples, and there's this major disturbance where Pilate has to get involved. Usually, I mean, it's very rare that the leader or the ruler of a territory gets involved, even like here in the United States. Very rare that the governor gets involved when there's an execution or somebody's going to jail. It's very rare. But here is an incident where Pilate, the man who's governing that region, has to get involved, and yet there's no record of this incident taking place. And also, too, that makes it also questionable is the fact that in the biblical story, Pilate declares that he's innocent. So how is it that he declares that the man is innocent, but then he allows a crowd to sway him, but he's firm that this man Jesus is innocent, but he still says, all right, well, he's innocent, but you want to kill him? All right, you can let, historians say it doesn't go with even Pilate's attitude in history, that he was a very staunch and stern, or governor of the area, so much so that the slightest infraction that the Jews would give him, he'd send the soldiers out of him. So the fact, or the claim that he would allow them to, after he declared the man innocent, he would allow them to say, well, no, we want him killed, it just doesn't seem that it's logical that it would go that way.
Well, didn't he release Barabbas in place of him? The story says it goes.
Well, right, he released him instead.
But he still stopped, and he did what he.
But no, I'm saying that it doesn't seem likely because he declared that the man was innocent. You see what I'm saying? He declared the man, he said that this man was innocent. So why would he allow them to let him kill the man that he said was innocent? You see what I'm saying? So, they just say it doesn't go with the character that Pilate was known to have, that he was very stern, that he would, like I said, the slightest infraction that the Jews gave him, that he had no problem bringing a hammer down upon them. So it just doesn't seem that it would go on. And as I said, the Romans have no record of this particular incident. They have no record of this case, so it's questionable.
This goes along with Pontius Pilate, but I think it also strives in sort of a different direction. One of my favorite parts in the Bible is the scene with Pontius Pilate and Jesus says something along the lines like something about truth, and Pontius Pilate asks Christ, "What is the truth?" And Jesus is silent. There's no answer to that. Has anyone ever asked you, what is the truth? And what is your answer to that?
What is the truth? I mean, when I try to determine the truth based upon the facts, the evidence, the proof, we do the best that we can, when I hear something or somebody says something or I read something, I try to ascertain to see if this is backed up by the facts. So to me, the truth is that which can be, as best we can, backed up by supporting evidences that show that whatever it is that's spoken of is true to the claim. Yeah.
Is there a devil in Islam?
Yes, in Islam there is a devil. In Arabic you say shaitan, or it's like Satan. But in Islam there's the devil. In Islam, he's considered of the unseen, the unseen spirits. And similar to Christianity, where he, might try to inspire you to do wrong or do evil in that sense. But he can't do it. But in Islam, he can't make you do anything. He doesn't. But he just, he's like called the whisperer. He whispers, from the unseen realm, whispers or implants evil thoughts or evil ideas into you. But it's still up to you. You can't say, oh, the devil made me do it. It was just an idea planted. It's up to you whether you act upon the impulse or reject it. Let me get some of an idea.
I'm just curious. Do you see the in the Bible? There's kind of you see kind of a back and forth with Satan and God, as you're saying, kind of relationship in the Quran. I'm just curious. Or is it just there, not really addressed? He's not really, like, quote unquote, a character.
No, I mean, well, give me some, like, when you say back and forth, like, what do you mean? Like, this is war, battle, like battle?
Like they're kind of like,
Job.
make a deal or something.
Yeah, like
there's nothing like that.
Okay. No, I mean, not so much. I mean, like, in the Quranic view, it mentions Satan.
But it just mentions him. He doesn't really address him.
Right. I mean, it mentions. I mean, it addresses, but it mentions him that he's like the enemy of mankind. You know what I mean? That we should be aware of him. That we should, resist and stand against the impulses of Satan and things like that. But not too much like a back and forth. The only thing that I can think of that's similar to that is speaking of, like, when it speaks of the creation of mankind. And Satan in the Quran says that he's like, when he sees that man is created, because he's a spirit, he's a spiritual being, that he says that he looks at mankind and he says, to God, who are these people? I'm better than them, because I'm made out of a certain material and mankind has been made from dust of the earth or whatever. So I'm better than them. So I'm not going to lower myself beyond them. And, and God admonishes him about that. But really, other than that, it's not too much of a back and forth,
So I'm gonna go back to the Pilate discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think it's actually kind of reasonable to think that he would allow the Jews to kill Jesus because Jews believed that Jesus wasn't the Son of God, because to them, it seemed quite radical that Jesus is declaring that he's the Son of God and God himself. So,
but that's what I'm saying, Pilate, why would he care about that? Why would he care about their religious beliefs? He's more concerned about governing the Roman territory. He's worried about threats to his rulership. So he really wouldn't care if that's what they thought. He'd be like, so what? I said he's innocent, and that would be it.
I would say just appeasement and just politics.
Right.
But that's what I'm saying. That a lot of times he didn't appease them. If you look upon the time that Pilate was ruling, like I said, there were many instances where a lot of bloodshed was done that he wasn't willing to appease them. He would willingly have bloodshed upon them. So it's not like that he would now be like, you know what, the man is innocent, you want me to kill him. He would have probably had kept his characters that he was known, which was to be very stern, and said, look, I said they're innocent. If you don't get out of here, I'm going to set the soldiers on you. Because that's what he was known to do most of the time.
How did Jesus die?
Well, from the Quranic perspective, that he was taken up. So he hasn't died a physical earthly death as of yet. You see, so no one killed him. If anything, he wasn't killed. No one has killed him. So, yeah.
I was just wondering. My friend keeps on talking about there's a balance between your deeds and sins. I was just wondering, is salvation guaranteed for a Muslim while on earth, or is it something they figure out after they die?
When you say guaranteed, how? In the sense, you still have your life to live. You don't know what you're going to do tomorrow. You don't know who's going to set you off, and you might do something in the last moment of anger. You see what I'm saying? So to speak of guarantees when you don't know the future, how can that be done? We have a promise of God being fair and just, but to say something is guaranteed, like I said, no one knows what you're going to do the next moment. You don't know. You might walk out of here and people. There's many stories of people who, in the moment of anger, do something. And they could have been the best person, a good person, but something sets them off in some kind of way, and they commit some heinous act. They kill somebody in a moment of anger. You see what I'm saying? So to say with a guarantee, only God knows that. And that's how Islam looks at it, that, we're not hopeless. In other words, we don't walk around hopeless like, I don't know what's going to happen. But, we have a hope that God is fair and God is just, and that he knows these things. We don't know the future. I don't know what's going to, so I can't. In other words, in Islam, it would be seen as arrogant to talk like that. You see, because you don't know what God knows. You see, I don't know, I know right now that I don't plan on doing, but again, I know throughout my life, there's things that have made me angry, and then you act out of anger in the moment, you might regret it later. Thank God I haven't done anything, to harm anybody, but, there are people who do that. There are people who, in a moment of anger, you might be so angry, you hit somebody so hard, the guy hits his head, he dies, now you killed him. You didn't mean to do it, but you acted of your anger, so you don't know. So we don't speak in those terms. We speak that, we're confident that God is just and that God is merciful, but as far as talking about guarantees of this nature, it's, in Islam it's considered arrogant, because you don't know, you're not God. Only God is the judge. He knows the future, he knows what happens. You don't know what happens tomorrow or years from now. Only God does that. So we don't talk in that type of manner. It's seen, like I said, I repeat, it's seen as being arrogant to speak like that when only God knows. I think you again.
Okay. I'm not one who interprets the Bible necessarily literally. Do you find that in the Islamic faith as well?
Yeah, you find that in both circles, that you have those who will take a literal interpretation of something, and then you have those who take an allegorical. Yeah, you will find that. Yeah. So, I'm sorry, she was.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, and I guess that also relates to whether you interpret it literally, but does the Quran expressly forbid dating, or is it more an issue of premarital sex?
Yeah, dating in Islam is not allowed. Yeah, we have the guidelines that you seek marriage, and there's ways to go about that. There's no just man and woman going out on your own. Mm-hmm. There's guidelines, and you go to the father of the woman you're interested in, or the woman can express to her father or guardian that she's interested in a man. And it's done through those channels, free dating and free living together, and it's not. Dennis, you're right.
Yeah, this I think goes directly off of the question too a little bit. Not so much marriage, but Jesus is, if I could wrap up his message, it was one of love and a deep sense of spiritual love. And I hear you saying the terms merciful and just a lot. And of course the Bible talks about a merciful and just God too. How does the Quran deal with the issue of love? And what does it say about love? Because the Bible says that love or charity, interchangeable terms maybe in the Bible, is the greatest thing. Does the Quran say something like that about God's love towards his children too?
I mean, it does. The Quran does speak about God, that he has love for the doers of justice. He has love for the righteous. You know, so in Islam, although you find that in the Bible too, it's not like this kind of widespread unconditional love. You know, God, he's intelligent enough to see that, you know, some people reject him and they don't want nothing to do with him. There's some people who are willing to live a life of crime and murder, and they don't give a darn about anything. So he's, you know, and again, like I said, from what I read in the Bible, I see that that's both in the Bible and Quran, where God, he's not just throwing it out to everybody. It does say in the Bible and the Quran that, you know, he doesn't like the murderers and the evildoers and those who are liars and the killers and things of that nature, but for those who are, because, you know, as human beings, we have that choice. So those of us who decide that we're going to willfully try to do God's will, obviously, and then the Quran makes like a parable about that too. That how can God, in other words, to ask us, how is it that we would think that God would look at everybody and say, here I am, and here you are trying to live a righteous life, and there are others who don't care. They're drinking, they're sleeping around, they're fornicating, and you know, whereas we're restraining ourselves. You know, if we wanted to, we could do those things. But here we are, purposely restraining ourselves from sleeping with a bunch of women freely, sleeping with men, or taking, you know, doing things that would harm ourselves, or holding ourselves back from trying to be greedy and stealing and robbing. And yet there are people out there who have no, you know, qualms about it, about restricting themselves. So he's saying, how do you think that God? Do you think that God would look at these people equally when here you're trying and the other person's not? So it's in that sense that, yes, he does have love for the believers, the righteous, those who are actually striving to do good, as opposed to those who reject him. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't care about them, because obviously for those people, you know, he still allows them to breathe. He still allows them to breathe the oxygen. They still are permitted to make a living, you know, even though they don't believe. So it's not that, you know, he has the love for those special ones who are trying to strive in his way, but the rest of humanity, even if they don't believe in him, he's still not totally unconcerned. You know, he still allows them, like I said, to partake of the earthly benefits, you know what I'm saying? And not only that, but he calls for those of us who do believe to try to call them, you see? So hopefully you understand what I'm saying. Like, it's a balance, not just a complete unconditional love that goes about without any type of, you know, discernment for an evildoer or a rejecter and a righteous person. You know?
Playing up this question, in the Bible, Jesus commands Christians, Paul's disciples, to love their enemies, which can be very hard, and you can tell the difference between a fake Christian and a true Christian. Is there the same thing in the Quran, and how can you tell between a fake Muslim and a real Muslim?
You mean as far as like loving the enemy?
As far as loving your enemy and doing the teachings that Jesus commanded, is there a same aspect in Islam where you have to do certain types of commands that God teaches or gives, and how do you differentiate between a true Muslim and a fake Muslim?
All right. Well, let's see. First, dealing with the enemy thing. What Islam teaches, obviously, because like you said, right, in Islam, you know, that's one thing I appreciate about it, that it allows us to, you know, use our common sense in that realm. In that, you know, it's unwise, at least from the Islamic perspective, to love your enemy. This person or this group is trying to do you harm. They're seeking to, you know, murder you or take from you, take something that's rightfully yours. So it's unreasonable to love them. However, Islam doesn't say you have to be hateful towards them. You know, Islam says you can make peace with them, or, you know, if as long as they're dealing with you in a right manner, you can deal with them in the right manner, even though you might be opposed to you know, certain issues or certain beliefs or certain systems or whatever. You can still deal with them on a fair and just basis. You don't have to it doesn't have to be like a hate relationship. You can deal with them as long as they're dealing with you right, even though, you know, you have opposing views or opposing positions. You can still deal with each other rightly and justly without having to mistreat one another. So that's how Islam would deal with a person who's an enemy in that sense. As far as the fake, I mean, like when you say fake Muslim, you mean like someone who's not practicing, basically? Like they're professing it, but they're not practicing. Well, I mean, you would, if the person has some level of sincerity, then Islam encourages you to talk to them. It says that a reminder benefits the believer. So if I see somebody who says that they're Muslim, but perhaps they're not doing everything they should be, that we should talk to them, give them a reminder, and the reminder benefit. If they're sincere in their heart, even though they're having whatever issue they're having, that should touch them, and the reminder should bring benefit. That hey, look, you should try to get back on track and get yourself in order and things like that. It doesn't have to be again where you have to treat them harshly or anything of that sort.
So part of the reason for us having you come tonight, and thank you again, you've done a fantastic job. We want to get Christians, and even I know there's some non-Christians in the room, like just comfortable speaking with Muslims. And in fact, there's probably a lot of people here that may have never spoken with a Muslim before. And so we kind of want to be, encouraged to do that more and to better understand Islam. But tomorrow, we're all going to go back in the real world. We're going to go to our jobs, go back in school. So what would you say as an encouragement to those of us who want to be able to share our faith with Muslims and to do that effectively in the sense of just improving our conversations with you? What would you say is an encouragement to us to do that?
Well, one thing I would say is, come at them like you would any other person. You know what I mean? In other words, come at them in a friendly manner. I've come across people who, and they want to approach and speak about it, but there's this like interrogative type of position that they come with, or they come with the loaded question. Why is it that you guys want to kill everybody who's not Muslim? You know what I mean? Instead, it's better if you could put it. Now, I don't mind a question like that, but put it in the form of a question. Say, look, hey, I heard that your religion teaches you, as opposed to where it's already loaded and you're already basically making the accusation in the question. And just speak to them in a normal manner like that, in a friendly manner. Questioning, good questioning like that will bring out good discussion. So if your questions are put in a good manner, it'll bring about a good discussion in return. As opposed to, like I said, because obviously, just imagine somebody comes to you with that type of questioning, it's going to put you on the defensive, and now you guys are going to be kind of hard on each other, and it may not get anywhere.
And most Muslims would be willing to talk. If we went to a Muslim, if we tell a Muslim or we knew they work, they're in class with us or something,
right.
Are most Muslims pretty receptive just to an open discussion?
Yeah, then now, of course, sometimes we have immigrants and, they may be new in the country, so obviously there may be a cultural difference there. But even then, most of them are acclimated to Western society, so you could speak to an immigrant or a Muslim who's American born, and most people are open to speak and talk, and yeah.
This is not a question, but just to add on to that,
I'm sorry.
we have a Muslim.
See, we have
a Muslim Student Association on campus, and the reason that I have a Quran is because they give out free Qurans for educational purposes. They also have informational pamphlets on a lot of the basic questions that you asked tonight, and in addition to several others. So they kind of detail that as like a general perspective of American Muslims, some things that international committees have come out and said in basically an FAQ format in a book. They have some other materials. They also have regular meetings. I'm not sure when they are because I think they're during one of my classes, so I can't go. But they give out lots of educational materials, and they exist purposely to bring Muslims together, but also to educate people about Islam in general. So if you have more questions once we run out of time tonight, I'm sure because their organization is designed for that, they'd be willing for that. If you guys ever want to borrow a Quran or to have a Quran to read the text and question it yourselves as well after this, they do have that material, and it's really, really good. And the Quran is really small, but it's beautiful. So it's actually really nice. And it's in English, I promise. You don't have to learn Arabic, it's okay.
You can take 2 more questions.
This is a kind of personal question, but I just wanted to know how many times have you prayed today?
Well, I've done 4, so I have to make the last one. And you?
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with the new documentary called Terror. It's about the FBI's persecution of American Muslims, and especially in post 9/11 society, and what kind of conversations are going on like around mosques and within Muslim communities, about this issue, because it is an issue.
Yeah, it is. I've seen, I've actually, when I lived in Virginia, I actually was invited and I spoke to the FBI headquarters over there in Virginia. Yeah, there's, unfortunately, there's been incidents where like sting operations and things like that. So usually in the communities, everyone's just told to, avoid anybody who comes to you and starts talking that type of, talk, that type of terroristic talk. Because obviously, most people are just trying to live their lives, go to work, pray, or whatever. So they're warned on people because unfortunately that's how the setup is done. Usually some person is sent in who will, the community itself doesn't have that type of talk, but someone is sent in who starts to then drum up that kind of talk. And some people lend an ear to it and they may get pulled in. So they're warned to watch out for people like that. And some communities have been good about weeding people like that out, based on that hey, look, we don't have that kind of stuff here. Get out of here with that. And but yeah, to be on the lookout for like that, things like, because I've seen there's the one if you want to watch, what was it called? Newburgh, I think it's called the Newburgh Sting. It was about the incident in Newburgh, New Jersey, where I remember when I saw it on the news, but then when I saw the documentary, I was like, wow, that was pretty amazing. That how it was set up like that. It was a similar situation. It was a mosque in New Jersey, Newburgh, New Jersey, and if you remember the incident, these were the guys who got arrested. I think the claim on the media was that they were going to try to commit a terrorist act against the fort. There's a fort, army fort somewhere in New Jersey, and a Jewish temple or whatever. But then when I saw the documentary, which showed that how they sent this guy, he was like, the community was predominantly African American, but they sent a Pakistani gentleman into the community out of nowhere, and they fell for it. He didn't get the community. The imam of the community was, telling people watch out, but he would take people aside privately and start to talk to them. And they had no intention of doing any harm, but he kept talking to them and talking to them. And some guys who were kind of shady already would get pulled into it. But even then, the guys who got pulled into it, it was interesting because he was recording the guy who was the sting agent, undercover agent, whatever. He wasn't necessarily an agent of the FBI. He was like, I don't know what they call it, but I guess he had some issues, and then they said, look, you want to get this issue taken care of, you got to do this, And so he was recording the conversation, and in the conversation, these guys, you could tell that they weren't really fluent in Islamic teachings, and even then, they really didn't want to do any harm. Like one of the recordings showed that the guy was like, okay, we'll do it, because he was offering them money. He was like, look, and they had problems. One guy, his mom had cancer, so he was like, look, I'll give you $100,000 for your mom's operation, things like that. But even then, the guys were like, we're just doing it for the money. They weren't doing it for the jihad. They weren't doing it, to affect some type of Islamic issue. They were like, look, I'm doing it for the money. The one recording was showing that the guy said, look, all right, we'll go ahead and, maybe put a little thing here, but we don't want nobody to get hurt. So, these things were said, but when the case came out, it was like a big thing. They had all these, and then the thing about it too was that everything was fake. The bombs that they were given were dummy bombs. So it was known that these things were totally fake, but they got set up like that. And so, again, to address your question, that the way the Muslim communities deal with is that, like for example, the mosque that I was the president of, we didn't allow any private meetings. You were not allowed to have any, nobody could make a private meeting unless they came through the board of directors and things. So that was a step that we took. A lot of masjids or mosques have the similar setup where you got to go through the leadership. If the leadership is not talking about it, then we don't allow anybody else to start, giving free speeches on their own and taking people aside. If they do something outside, obviously you can't control everything. But the mosques themselves, these are the precautions that they've taken. Of course, warning the attenders that come to the mosque, but again, not allowing unauthorized meetings and things like that. A lot of mosques, they get locked up at certain times to avoid people coming in on their own and doing stuff like that. So those are some of the ways that the community, nationwide is trying to deal with those type of things.
So it almost seems that those types of operations, when there's an outside element, i.e. the FBI, it could even be causal in terms of who they convinced to engage in these acts, and that they weren't even considering prior to.
Right, yeah.
So
I think the word they call those people patsy is the slang term of patsy, who, you know, the person is not that bright. But yeah, they had no intention before that. That's the thing that I find interesting, is that a lot of at least the ones here in the United States, where we hear on the news that he was homegrown, that a lot of times you find out that the person prior to the incident had no intention of doing any type of harm, but, you know, they got it with the so-called undercover agent or whatever, and they talked them into it, or some kind of thing like this, and this is how it was done. But prior to that, the person didn't have the means, they didn't have the money, they had no connections, you know, so if they were left on their own, it would never have been an incident, because they had no connection, they had no intention to do it. It was only at the coaxing of this outside person that gave them the so-called connections and money that they would never have had. So was it really a true incident if they themselves didn't have the incident or the means to do it? And it's like a act, you know.
Have you read any books by Hassan Youssef or Wali Shabat?
Wali Shabat, yes, I'm familiar with Wali Shabat. Hassan Youssef.
Hassan Youssef was ex-PLO. His father was second in command in PLO.
Oh, that's the one, yeah, that he became a Christian or something like that. Son of Hamas, yeah. I haven't read his book. The other one though, Wali Shabat, now his stuff is kind of shady. Wali Shabat, the other I have to look into and see. But Wali Shabat, from what I've seen, because I've even seen like mainstream media report that there's no evidence that he was ever a member of any of these groups, and they even show that he lied at some of the dates that he claimed that he had done some acts that he couldn't have done it because, you know, he wasn't, just, you know what I mean? And then he's never been on any watch list, because even if you claim, you know, just imagine that the FBI is going to let you go because you said you became a Christian. No, you'd still be on the watch list because you could be lying. So a lot of these people, what I found, are unfortunately liars, that they claim that, you know, because it makes it sound good. I mean, that's the perfect story.
His father was actually an Israeli prison and known terrorist.
But yeah, I mean, well, basically my thing with them is that I'm not impressed by it, because, you know, I mean, if I say, hey, look, guys, I used to be a Christian, now Muslim, Islam is, you know, that's not, to me, a convincing argument. And then on top of that, a lot of these guys, their information is either blatantly wrong, they're outright lying, and so to me, it seems like it's just a ploy to, you know, it sounds good. I mean, hey, look, I'm a former terrorist, and now I've accepted Christ. Yeah, that's, you know, if you fall for that kind of thing, it sounds good and wonderful. But me as a Muslim, I look at it and I examine what they say, and it doesn't check out. And I say, so if he was Muslim, he was a very ignorant Muslim, because the stuff that he claims that Islam teaches, and I've done it. I have videos where I take point by point and knock out all their arguments out with proof from Islamic sources to say, look, if this guy was the Muslim that people wanted, the so-called ex-Muslim that you want to give credit to, he was very ignorant. It would be just like, you know.
So Hamas are ignorant Muslims, pretty much.
I mean, in what particular, I mean, Hamas came about because of their issue with Israel. You know, I mean, it would be like the Black Panthers in the United States.
But they justify their actions through.
You know, it's a cause and effect thing. So I mean, again, to me, Hamas is more or less acting upon political. They're not acting because of any Islamic issue per se. They were created out of the Israeli, you know, what they say is the mistreatment of the Israelis against Palestinians. Just like, you know, the Black Panthers in the 60s said they were formed because of mistreatment of, you know, Caucasian Americans against Black Americans. So it's a cause and effect thing, and it's not necessarily a religious mandated thing. It was born out of that conflict.